When former actress Victoria Sterling thought her biggest worry was missing her charity gala, she had no idea that a routine traffic stop would uncover secrets from her past that powerful people had spent millions trying to bury. Some stories refuse to stay hidden, no matter how deep you try to bury them. The black sedan's engine hummed smoothly along the coastal highway as Victoria Sterling adjusted her rearview mirror for the third time in 10 minutes. She wasn't being paranoid. She'd learned the hard way that privacy was a luxury she could no longer afford. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Pacific Coast Highway, and she found herself actually enjoying the drive for the first time in months. No photographers. No questions shouted from behind barriers. Just her, the road, and the sound of waves crashing against the cliffs below. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat, another message from her publicist about the charity event she was supposed to attend that evening. The Children's Education Foundation Gala had been on her calendar for weeks, but the thought of another night filled with forced smiles and careful answers made her stomach tighten. She'd promised herself that moving to California would mean a fresh start, a chance to focus on causes that actually mattered to her instead of just showing up to events for appearances. Victoria had never imagined her life would take such dramatic turns. 5 years ago, she'd been a struggling actress in Toronto, taking whatever roles she could get and waiting tables between auditions. Her biggest claim to fame had been a recurring role on a legal drama that most people had forgotten existed. Then came the whirlwind romance, the fairy tale wedding, and suddenly she was thrust into a world of protocol, tradition, and scrutiny that no acting class could have prepared her for. The red and blue lights appeared in her mirror without warning, cutting through her thoughts like a knife. Victoria's heart immediately began racing, though she couldn't understand why. She hadn't been speeding. She'd been extra careful about that ever since moving here. The attention that came with any minor infraction wasn't worth the risk. She pulled over to the shoulder, her hands gripping the steering wheel as she watched the patrol car settle behind her. Officer Marcus Rodriguez had been with the California Highway Patrol for 12 years, and he'd seen every type of driver imaginable. When he'd spotted the black sedan, something about it had caught his attention. Maybe it was the way it had been maintaining exactly the speed limit, or perhaps the tinted windows that seemed just a shade too dark. His instincts, honed by over a decade of traffic stops, told him to take a closer look. As he approached the driver's window, he couldn't shake the feeling that he recognized the woman behind the wheel. She lowered the window with a practiced smile, the kind that didn't quite reach her eyes. He'd seen that look before. The careful composure of someone who was used to being watched, analyzed, and judged. "Good afternoon, ma'am. I'm Officer Rodriguez with the California Highway Patrol. Do you know why I stopped you today?" Victoria's mind raced through the possibilities. She'd been driving carefully, hadn't used her phone, had her seatbelt on. "I'm sorry, officer, but I'm not sure. Was I speeding?" Rodriguez shook his head, his expression professional but curious. "No, your speed was fine. I noticed your window tinting looks like it might exceed the legal limit for California. Can I see your license and registration, please?" The request sent a chill through Victoria that had nothing to do with the ocean breeze. Her license was still from her previous residence, and she knew that the moment he ran it through the system, her location would be logged, tracked, and potentially leaked. She'd changed addresses 3 times in the past year, each time hoping to find some semblance of normalcy, only to have photographers show up within weeks. "Of course," she said, reaching for her purse with hands that she hoped appeared steadier than they felt. As she handed over her documents, she noticed Rodriguez studying her face with the focused attention of someone trying to place a familiar stranger. "Victoria Sterling," he read from the license, and she saw the moment of recognition flash across his features. She'd been hoping to fly under the radar for a few more months, but it seemed that dream was about to end. Rodriguez walked back to his patrol car, and Victoria watched in her mirror as he began typing information into his computer. She knew the routine well enough by now. He'd run her license, check for any outstanding warrants or violations, and probably call in to verify her identity. What she hadn't expected was how long he was taking, or the way he seemed to be making additional phone calls. The minutes stretched on, each one feeling like an hour. Victoria found herself thinking about the path that had brought her to this moment, the acting career that had started with such promise, the unexpected romance that had changed everything, the difficult decision to step back from public life, and now this strange limbo, where she was famous enough to be recognized but trying desperately to live a private life. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. The caller ID showed her security consultant David Chen, and she answered immediately. "Victoria, where are you right now?" His voice carried an urgency that made her stomach drop. "I'm pulled over on PCH. A police officer stopped me for tinted windows. Why? There was a pause that lasted too long. How long ago did this happen? Maybe 10 minutes. He's been in his car running my license. David, what's going on? Listen to me carefully. There's been some unusual activity on your digital footprint today. Someone's been accessing records that should be sealed. I don't think this is a routine traffic stop. Victoria felt the world shift around her. She glanced back at Officer Rodriguez, who was now talking animatedly into his radio. What kind of records? Airport surveillance from your last international trip. Immigration databases. Things that require federal clearance to access. Someone with serious resources is digging into your background. The pieces began falling into place in Victoria's mind. The seemingly minor infraction that had caused the stop, the extended time Rodriguez was spending on what should have been a simple license check, and now David's warning about someone accessing her sealed records. This wasn't coincidence. What do I do? She asked, surprised by how calm her voice sounded despite the panic building in her chest. Cooperate fully, but don't volunteer any information. Record everything if you can. And, Victoria, call me the moment you're free to go. Rodriguez was walking back toward her car, and Victoria quickly ended the call. She took a deep breath, drew on every acting lesson she'd ever learned, and prepared to face whatever came next. She'd survived scandal before, navigated through media storms that would have destroyed others, but something about this felt different, more dangerous. Sterling, Rodriguez said as he approached her window again. His demeanor noticeably changed. I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle. Is there a problem with my license? She asked, though she already knew the answer would be more complicated than a simple yes or no. Ma'am, I need you to step out of the car and put your hands where I can see them. Victoria's heart hammered against her ribs as she complied with the request. The warm California afternoon suddenly felt cold, and she could hear the distant sound of another vehicle approaching. This was escalating far beyond a routine traffic stop, and she had no idea why. As she stood beside her car, hands visible and mind racing, Rodriguez positioned himself carefully, his hand resting near his service weapon. Miss Sterling, there are some questions about your recent travel history that need to be addressed. I'm going to need you to come with me to the station. Am I under arrest? The question came out stronger than she felt. You're being detained for questioning regarding potential immigration violations and document irregularities. The second patrol car pulled up, and Victoria watched as two more officers emerged. One was a woman in her 40s, with sharp eyes and an expression that suggested this was far from routine. The other was a younger man who immediately began examining her vehicle. Officer Sarah Martinez had been called in specifically for this stop. 20 years in law enforcement had taught her to recognize when a case was bigger than it appeared on the surface. When the call had come in about Victoria Sterling, she'd been given very specific instructions that came from much higher up the chain of command than usual. Miss Sterling, Martinez said, approaching with the kind of professional courtesy that barely masked underlying suspicion. I understand you've been cooperative. That's appreciated. We're going to need to search your vehicle and ask you some questions about your recent international travel. Victoria felt the trap closing around her, though she still didn't understand what had triggered it. I haven't done anything wrong. I'd like to call my attorney. That's your right, Martinez acknowledged, but I should let you know that we have some very interesting information about airport security footage from your last trip abroad. Information that raises questions about discrepancies in your official travel records. The words hit Victoria like a physical blow. She'd been so careful, had followed every legal requirement, had been transparent with immigration officials. What could they possibly have found? As Martinez began reading her Miranda rights, Victoria's mind flashed to the charity gala she was supposed to attend that evening, the children who were counting on the funds that would be raised, the carefully constructed new life she'd been trying to build. All of it was about to come crashing down because of something she didn't even understand. The handcuffs clicked into place, and Victoria Sterling realized that her afternoon drive had just become the beginning of something that would either destroy her completely or finally force the truth into the light. As they led her toward the patrol car, she caught a glimpse of a black SUV parked on the opposite side of the highway, its occupants watching through tinted windows. Someone had been waiting for this moment, and Victoria was beginning to understand that she'd been walking into a trap that had been months in the making. The question now was whether she was strong enough to survive whatever came next, and whether the secrets from her past would finally be her salvation or her complete undoing. The fluorescent lights in the interrogation room buzzed with an irritating frequency that seemed designed to wear down anyone unfortunate enough to spend time there. Victoria had been sitting in the uncomfortable metal chair for 2 hours, her attorney still en route from Los Angeles. The initial shock of her arrest had worn off, replaced by a growing anger that someone was manipulating her life from the shadows. Detective James Walsh entered the room carrying a thick manila folder and a tablet computer. He was older than the officers who had arrested her, with grey temples and the weathered look of someone who'd seen too much in his career. His eyes held a mixture of curiosity and skepticism as he settled across from her at the small table. Ms. Sterling, I apologize for the delay. I'm Detective Walsh with the Multi-Agency Task Force on Immigration Security. I understand you've been waiting for your attorney. Victoria studied his face, looking for tells that might help her understand what was really happening. Detective Walsh, I still don't understand why I'm here. My immigration status is completely legal. I've never violated any travel restrictions. Walsh opened the folder and spread several photographs across the table. Victoria's breath caught as she recognized herself in what appeared to be airport security footage. The images showed her at various international airports over the past 2 years, but something was wrong with them. The timestamps didn't match her memory of when these trips had occurred. These are interesting photos, don't you think? Walsh asked, watching her reaction carefully. Heathrow Airport, Charles de Gaulle, Zurich International. The problem is, according to your official travel documents, you weren't supposed to be in any of these locations on these dates. Victoria leaned forward to examine the photos more closely. The woman in the images was definitely her, but the dates were completely wrong. According to the timestamps, she'd been in London on a Tuesday when she clearly remembered being in New York for a medical appointment. The Zurich photo showed her allegedly arriving on a date when she'd been in California attending her friend's wedding. These dates are incorrect, she said firmly. I can prove where I was on each of these days. These photos have been manipulated. Walsh raised an eyebrow. That's a serious accusation, Ms. Sterling. You're suggesting that multiple international airport security systems have been compromised to create false evidence against you? Before Victoria could respond, the door opened and a woman in an expensive suit entered. She was tall, blonde, and carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to commanding attention. Victoria had never seen her before, but something about her presence immediately put her on edge. Detective Walsh, I'm Agent Rebecca Harrison with the Department of Homeland Security. She flashed a badge and took a seat without being invited. Ms. Sterling, thank you for your cooperation in this matter. Victoria felt the situation shifting into even more dangerous territory. I wasn't aware that Homeland Security was involved in traffic stops for window tinting. Agent Harrison smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Window tinting was just the pretext, Ms. Sterling. We've been monitoring your activities for several months now, based on intelligence we received about potential security concerns related to your previous associations. The words hit Victoria like ice water. Her previous associations could only mean one thing: her former life before moving to California. The connections and relationships that had brought her both fame and scrutiny. Someone was using her past against her, but she still couldn't understand why or who would benefit from destroying her new life. What associations? She demanded. I've been completely transparent about my background. I've submitted to every security check required. Harrison opened her own tablet and began scrolling through what appeared to be a detailed dossier. Your relationship with Marcus Hartwell, for instance. A businessman who was recently investigated for money laundering through his charitable foundation. You attended 17 events with him over a 2-year period. Victoria's mind raced. Marcus had been a friend, nothing more, and she'd had no knowledge of any criminal activities. Their relationship had been entirely social, centered around shared interests in environmental causes and children's education. Marcus is a friend who shares my philanthropic interests. If he's involved in illegal activities, I had no knowledge of it. Perhaps not, Harrison conceded, but your travel patterns during that period coincide remarkably well with his business trips. The photos we showed you? They align with dates when Mr. Hartwell was conducting transactions that we now know were part of his laundering operation. The implications crashed over Victoria like a wave. Someone had been using her unknowingly as cover for illegal activities, arranging for her to be in the same cities at the same times, to provide legitimacy to what appeared to be business meetings. The realization made her feel violated and manipulated in a way she'd never experienced.
You're suggesting I was being used without my knowledge,
she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her chest. Detective Walsh leaned forward. What we're suggesting, Ms. Sterling, is that either you were an unwitting accomplice or you were more involved than you're admitting. Either way, we need to understand the full extent of your relationship with Hartwell and his associates. Victoria's phone, which had been taken when she was arrested, sat on the table between them. It buzzed with an incoming call, and she could see her security consultant David's name on the display. The timing seemed too coincidental to ignore. "That's my security consultant," she said. "He called me just before I was arrested to warn me that someone was accessing sealed records about me. Perhaps you should speak with him." Harrison and Walsh exchanged glances. "Mr. Chen has been trying to reach us as well," Harrison admitted. "He claims to have information about who might be targeting you." The door opened again, and Victoria's attorney, Patricia Williams, finally arrived. She was a formidable woman in her 50s who specialized in high-profile criminal defense, and her presence immediately shifted the dynamic in the room. "Gentlemen, Agent Harrison," Patricia said briskly, settling her briefcase on the table. "I assume my client has been read her rights and that you have probable cause for this detention?" "She's here voluntarily, Counselor," Walsh said, though they all knew that was a technicality. Patricia opened her briefcase and pulled out her own tablet. "I've been in contact with Mr. Repavic Chen, and we have some very interesting information about the source of these airport photos. It seems someone has been paying substantial sums to private investigators and computer specialists to create exactly this kind of compromising evidence." Victoria felt a surge of hope mixed with dread. If Patricia and David could prove the evidence was fabricated, it would clear her name but raise even more disturbing questions about who was orchestrating this attack on her life. Harrison leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. "That's a serious allegation. Do you have proof of this conspiracy?" Patricia slid a document across the table. Bank records showing payments to 3 different digital forensics companies, all specializing in video manipulation. Financial records indicating that someone paid over $200,000 to create convincing but false airport surveillance footage. And most interestingly, phone records showing coordination between these companies and a private investigation firm that has been tracking Mr. Reku Sterling's movements for over a year. Victoria watched as both investigators examined the documents. The evidence was damning, but not in the way they'd expected. Instead of proving her guilt, it suggested she was the victim of an elaborate frame job by someone with significant resources and a sophisticated understanding of how to manipulate digital evidence. "Who's behind it?" Victoria asked, though she was beginning to suspect she already knew. Patricia consulted her notes. The payments traced back to a shell company registered in Delaware. It took some digging, but the ultimate source of the funds appears to be Elizabeth Carmichael. The name hung in the air like a curse. Elizabeth Carmichael was a socialite and philanthropist who had publicly blamed Victoria for the collapse of a major charity event the previous year. What had seemed like a minor social conflict had apparently escalated into something far more sinister. Detective Walsh looked genuinely surprised. "Mrs. Carmichael? The same woman who sits on the board of half the major charities in the state?" "The same," Patricia confirmed. "It appears she's been systematically working to destroy Miss Sterling's reputation and legal status. The question is whether she's acted alone or had help from others who wanted my client neutralized." Victoria felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place, though the full picture was still unclear. Elizabeth had never forgiven her for the charity incident, which hadn't even been Victoria's fault. But this level of revenge seemed far beyond what a social slight would warrant. Agent Harrison was making notes on her tablet, her professional mask slipping slightly. "This changes the nature of our investigation significantly. If these allegations are true, Miss Sterling may be the victim rather than the perpetrator." "Maybe?" Patricia's voice carried a sharp edge. "My client has been falsely accused, illegally surveilled, and subjected to a campaign of harassment that borders on stalking. The only question now is whether law enforcement will pursue the real criminals or continue to harass the victim." Victoria watched the dynamic in the room shift as the investigators began to realize they'd been manipulated as surely as she had been. Someone had used the justice system as a weapon against her, feeding false information to trigger exactly this kind of investigation. "Detective Walsh," she said quietly, "when you ran my license this afternoon, how quickly did information about these travel discrepancies appear in your system?" "Within minutes of running your information, we received an alert about potential immigration violations. The photos were already flagged in the database." Someone was waiting for me to be stopped, Victoria realized. They had everything ready to go the moment my name appeared in any law enforcement database. This wasn't about window tinting or random suspicion. Someone wanted me arrested today, specifically. Patricia nodded grimly. which means they're probably watching this investigation right now, waiting to see if their plan worked. Harrison closed her tablet with a sharp snap. Miss Sterling, it appears you may have been the target of a sophisticated disinformation campaign. We're going to need your full cooperation in investigating who was behind this and how deep it goes. Victoria looked around the room at the three people who, just hours ago, had been treating her as a suspect. Now they were potential allies in uncovering a conspiracy that went far deeper than she'd imagined. The question was whether they could move fast enough to stay ahead of whoever was orchestrating this attack on her life. "What do you need from me?" she asked, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "Everything," Harrison replied. "Every interaction you've had with Elizabeth Carmichael, every detail about your relationship with Marcus Hartwell, and most importantly, any idea why someone would go to these lengths to destroy you." As Victoria began to recount her story, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were still missing crucial pieces of the puzzle. The resources required for this kind of operation suggested someone with far more power and motivation than a scorned socialite, someone who saw her as a genuine threat to something much more important than charity event attendance. The afternoon sun was fading outside the small window of the interrogation room, and Victoria realized that her simple drive along the coast had turned into something that would either expose a criminal conspiracy or destroy what remained of her carefully rebuilt life. Either way, there was no turning back now. 3 weeks after her arrest, Victoria sat in a secure conference room at the federal building in downtown Los Angeles, surrounded by evidence that painted a picture more complex and dangerous than anyone had initially imagined. The investigation had expanded beyond a simple case of harassment into something that touched the highest levels of political and corporate power. Special Agent Michael Torres of the FBI had taken over the case from Agent Harrison, bringing with him a team of specialists in financial crimes and digital forensics. The evidence they'd uncovered was spread across multiple screens around the room, creating a web of connections that reached far beyond Elizabeth Carmichael's personal vendetta. "Miss Sterling," Agent Torres began, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd spent weeks unraveling a conspiracy. "What we've discovered goes far beyond what any of us initially suspected. Elizabeth Carmichael was indeed the initial catalyst, but she was being funded and guided by much more powerful interests." Victoria's attorney Patricia Williams leaned forward, her pen poised over a legal pad. David Chen, Victoria's security consultant, sat beside her, laptop open to display his own findings that had proven crucial to the investigation. The shell company that funded the surveillance and evidence fabrication was owned by Carmichael, Torres continued. But the money came from somewhere else entirely. We've traced it back to Sterling Industries. Victoria felt the world tilt around her. Sterling Industries? But that's my family's company. My brother runs it now. The silence in the room was deafening. David was the first to speak, his voice gentle but firm. "Victoria, we need to talk about your family dynamics, about why your brother might want you permanently discredited and unable to return to any position of influence." The pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity. When Victoria had left her previous life to start over in California, she'd signed documents transferring her interests in the family business to her brother Jonathan. What she hadn't realized was that those documents were temporary, designed to protect the company during a period of intense public scrutiny. Her legal right to reclaim her position had never been permanently severed. "The company has grown exponentially in the past 3 years," Patricia said, consulting her own research. "From a mid-sized real estate development firm to a major player in international construction projects. Your brother has positioned himself as the sole heir and decision-maker, but your return to public life could complicate that narrative." Agent Torres activated one of the wall screens, displaying financial records and corporate filings. Sterling Industries has secured several major government contracts worth over $800 million. Contracts that required extensive background checks on all major shareholders and family members. Your brother couldn't risk having those contracts questioned because of your high-profile background and the scrutiny that comes with it. Victoria stared at the numbers on the screen, trying to process the magnitude of what was being revealed. Her own family had orchestrated her destruction to protect business interests she'd voluntarily walked away from. "There's more," David said quietly. "Jonathan didn't just want you discredited, he wanted you deported."
The words hit Victoria like a physical blow.
"Deported? But I'm a citizen. I was born here. Your citizenship status is more complicated than that," Agent Torres explained. "When you married and moved abroad, you took citizenship in another country. The process of maintaining dual citizenship has some technical requirements that most people aren't aware of. Your brother's legal team discovered a potential technicality that could have been used to challenge your American citizenship if you were convicted of immigration violations. The elegant trap began to reveal itself fully. If Victoria had been convicted based on the fabricated evidence, it would have triggered a review of her citizenship status. The technical violation that Jonathan's lawyers had discovered would have provided grounds for deportation proceedings. Once she was out of the country and unable to return, her shares in Sterling Industries would have been permanently forfeited. Patricia was taking rapid notes, her expression growing more grim by the minute. This is conspiracy, fraud, and attempted theft on a massive scale. Jonathan Sterling orchestrated an elaborate frame job against his own sister to steal her inheritance and eliminate any potential challenge to his control of a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Victoria found herself thinking about her brother, the boy she'd grown up with, who'd taught her to ride a bike and helped her with homework. The idea that he could have planned something so coldly calculated and personally devastating was almost impossible to accept. How did Elizabeth Carmichael fit into all this? She asked. David pulled up another screen showing communication records. Carmichael was the perfect cover. Her social dispute with you provided a believable motive for harassment. Jonathan's people approached her, offered to fund her revenge, and provided her with the resources to make it look legitimate. She thought she was getting back at you for a social slight. She had no idea she was part of a corporate takeover. Agent Torres nodded. Carmichael is cooperating fully now that she understands how she was manipulated. She's provided us with recorded conversations and email communications that show exactly how she was recruited and guided by Jonathan's associates. The investigation had also revealed the extent of the surveillance operation. For over a year, private investigators hired by Jonathan had been tracking Victoria's movements, identifying patterns in her travel and social connections, and looking for any angle that could be used against her. When they discovered her friendship with Marcus Hartwell, they'd seen an opportunity. Hartwell's money laundering operation was already under investigation, Torres explained. Jonathan's team didn't create that criminal activity, but they manipulated the timing of your social events to create the appearance of coordination. They wanted investigators to believe you were either complicit in the money laundering or at minimum compromised by your association with Hartwell. Victoria felt a wave of nausea as she realized how thoroughly her life had been manipulated. Every social event, every charitable appearance, every decision she'd made about where to live and how to rebuild her life had been monitored and potentially influenced by people working for her own brother. Patricia looked up from her notes. We need to talk about what comes next. Jonathan Sterling is facing federal charges for conspiracy, fraud, and violation of civil rights. Sterling Industries is going to be under intense scrutiny, and there will likely be questions about whether the government contracts were obtained legally. What about Victoria's position in the company? David asked. That's complicated, Torres admitted. Legally, she never actually forfeited her ownership rights. The temporary transfer documents her brother used were never meant to be permanent. But untangling the corporate structure and determining what she's legally entitled to will require extensive litigation. Victoria listened to the discussion of her financial future with a strange sense of detachment. 3 weeks ago, her biggest concern had been whether to attend a charity gala. Now she was at the center of a federal investigation that would likely dominate headlines for months and fundamentally alter her family relationships forever. I need to see him, she said suddenly, interrupting the legal discussion. Everyone in the room turned to look at her. Patricia was the first to respond. Victoria, that's not advisable. Anything you say to Jonathan could be used in the criminal proceedings.
I don't care about the legal implications right now, Victoria said, surprised by the strength in her voice.
I need to understand how the brother I grew up with could do this to me. I need to hear it from him directly. Agent Torres considered the request. We could arrange a supervised meeting. He's in federal custody, but we could set up a conversation in a controlled environment. Patricia was shaking her head. This is a mistake. You're emotionally compromised, and Jonathan will likely try to manipulate you further. Maybe, Victoria acknowledged. But I need closure on this. I need to understand whether the person I thought I knew ever actually existed, or if I was fooling myself about who my brother really was. David closed his laptop and looked at Victoria with the concern of someone who'd become more than just a professional advisor over the past months. What will you do after this is resolved? Your name will be cleared, your citizenship is secure, and you'll likely have significant financial resources restored to you. But the media attention will be intense. Victoria looked around the room at the evidence of betrayal that surrounded her. Photos, financial records, phone transcripts, and email communications that told the story of how the person closest to her had tried to destroy her life for money and power. The charity gala she'd missed 3 weeks ago seemed like a lifetime ago. "I'm going to rebuild," she said finally. "Not just my life, but the company." Sterling Industries was started by our grandfather to create affordable housing for working families. Jonathan turned it into a tool for personal enrichment. "I'm going to return it to its original mission."
Agent Torres was nodding approvingly.
"There will be significant legal and regulatory hurdles. The government contracts will likely be suspended pending investigation. Some of the international projects may be cancelled entirely." "Good," Victoria said firmly. "I'd rather have a smaller company that operates ethically than a massive one built on lies and manipulation." Patricia was making more notes. "We'll need to file civil suits to recover damages, both financial and personal. The surveillance operation alone violated numerous privacy laws. The fabricated evidence could be grounds for significant punitive damages." As the meeting continued and the legal team discussed strategy and timeline, Victoria found herself thinking about the children who would have benefited from the charity gala she'd missed. The irony wasn't lost on her that her brother's attempt to steal her inheritance had actually positioned her to do far more good with Sterling Industries' resources than she could have achieved through individual charitable giving. The investigation would continue for months. Jonathan would likely face years in federal prison. Elizabeth Carmichael would probably receive a lighter sentence in exchange for her cooperation, but her social standing was permanently destroyed. The private investigators and digital forensics specialists who had created the fake evidence were facing their own criminal charges. But for Victoria, the real work was just beginning. Rebuilding a company, restoring relationships with employees who had been misled about her character, and navigating the media attention that would inevitably follow the public revelation of the conspiracy would require every lesson she'd learned from her years in the public eye. As she walked out of the federal building into the warm California sunshine, Victoria realized that the traffic stop that had seemed like the end of her carefully constructed new life had actually been the beginning of something far more meaningful. She'd spent 3 years trying to hide from her past and avoid controversy. Now she was ready to step back into the light and fight for something that mattered. Her phone buzzed with a message from the Children's Education Foundation, asking if she would consider being the keynote speaker at their next gala. Victoria smiled as she typed her response. After everything she'd been through, it seemed fitting that her return to public life would begin exactly where this journey had started, with a commitment to helping children build better futures. The black sedan that had started this entire ordeal was still in the police impound lot, but Victoria didn't need it anymore. She had work to do, and this time, she wouldn't be driving alone. The team of lawyers, investigators, and loyal employees who had stood by her would be right there beside her as she rebuilt not just a company, but a legacy that her grandfather would have been proud of. The truth had finally been unveiled, and Victoria Sterling was ready to face whatever came next.